Very good. Is this on? You hear me all right? Okay, very good. Just want to be sure of that. Let me, this is described as a wisdom seminar, which is extremely challenging, shall I say, criterion, and I doubt seriously that I'll be able to convey anything which will make you wiser. I'm not sure how wise I am. I sometimes think my only claim to that particular category is that I'm aware of the fact that I'm not wise. I think that's probably an important limitation. I'm just going to review in a sort of a random fashion some attitudes I've had, some of my career choices, some of the difficulties, not career difficulties. I really did not have I had a very satisfying, as it turned out, a very satisfying career. It wasn't that obvious to begin with for reasons I'll mention in a minute. To remember, let me give you one statistic that you probably know, and namely I was born in 1921. I realize this is not really ancient, but sort of prehistoric. I keep on running into college students who sort of think we were somewhat involved in Vietnam, but they're not too sure where it is. And Hitler is some kind of mythical creature, these things which were extremely vibrant, episodes are extremely vibrant in my own experience. So you have to bear with me when you think about this. And in particular, a historical episode which has come back into the public discussion in the last year, namely the Great Depression. This was the period when I was in high school and then as an undergraduate. And it was a terrifying experience. We and my family suffered from it. And not only my family, but the whole economic world. Remember, it lasted. It wasn't only that it was bad, which it certainly was, but it lasted a very long time. It was really from 1930 to 1940. Yeah, at a period when after I was developing, and in particular, looking forward to trying to make a living. Looking forward to the idea of making a living. I was in the preparation stages. I was, foresighted. My parents were foresighted, so you think ahead. Of course, as you see, most of the thoughts are wrong, but they were very helpful. I should preface by saying that my view of my life, that's one of the reasons why the word wisdom, the idea that I have anything useful to convey to you is dubious, is that it seems to me, even at the time and in retrospect, that my career is built very much on a set of extremely lucky accidents, none of which I could have foreseen. So you have to take that into account. At least that's my perception of my world, and I think I'm not sure. I think it's pretty accurate, actually. I was a pretty good student. I was an outstanding student, and I was generally, one of the few best students in the class. So I was accustomed to that kind of success. I was also accustomed to the idea that I always read a little ahead. I was a little ahead of the class, so I realized there was an awful lot more that we weren't covering that I hadn't learned. In high school, I realized I had something of a talent for mathematics. In those days, economics was not taught in secondary schools on the grounds it required a certain degree of social maturity before you understood what an economic situation was. And while now it's rather common to teach it in high schools, I'm not sure the older view wasn't really right. It's just not. You can learn mathematics as a kid, but you can't really learn economics because you don't have it requires experience. In any case, I was concerned about my career. I went to a municipal college because it was free. It was pretty good. Actually, the education, the mathematics, in fact, was very good. Which is what I concentrated on. I've always been interested in all sorts of things. I've never been monolithic, and in particular, I was interested in history. But I tended to try to systematize. I always I'd read something, I'd read something else, I'd try to put them together in my own way. Just, if I read about two different countries, I'd try to see how they were connected with each other, what the time, at least get this time sequences right so that I know which was contemporary with what. Then when I got to college, I had to really contemplate what I was going to make a living at. Economic circumstances mattered a great deal. And in particular, I was looking for something stable, something not necessarily a lot of money, but just something. When I had no capacity, I realized I probably had no capacity for something like business, and I wasn't going to do that. But because I didn't think I was the type, and I think that's quite correct. But I was looking for something stable. Well, what kind of careers were stable? And obviously something would use the fact that I liked mathematics and was a mathematics concentration. Well, the three things occurred to me. I was also, by the way, sufficiently up to date, modern in the view that I understood the importance of flexibility. You can't just concentrate on one thing because it might not work out. You have to have several possibilities. And the most obvious thing was to be a high school teacher of mathematics. That was my primary aim in life. So I really concentrated on it. I took courses which was in retrospect were a total waste of time, on how to teach, the educational psychology, because you had to take these courses to qualify to be a teacher. And in fact, I did actually, in my my last year in college, I actually was what I called a practice teacher. I actually spent a few hours a week at a nearby secondary school and helped the teacher, actually taught a little special course. In fact, I had probably the best teaching experience of my life, teaching a bunch of students who were having trouble. And it turned out that was a great success. I've never been as good a teacher at anything since then. But it was a very satisfying experience. However, there was one drawback. There were no jobs. This was a depression, so of course I was not the only one who wanted to be a teacher. There was a big demand, a big supply of people who wanted to be teachers and who had already passed the relevant examinations. So they would not give a new qualifying examination until the old list was used up, which was 7 years earlier, by the way, to give you an idea of what they said. Well, I say anybody who could possibly have a claim. So it didn't look like that teaching was going to be, as I began to get the view that teaching was not going to be like experience. If the job had been there, that may well have been my career. That's why I said there's a certain amount of randomness. Well, and I realized this even when I was a student, that I might not have this career. So what do you do with mathematics practically if you're not, somehow the idea of being a professor never occurred to me. That was not, you don't, my father going to college, I sort of although he came from an extremely poor background, had actually worked his way through college, but somehow to be a professor was one level beyond what people of my type were thinking of. That only came it came a little later, but not much later. So one of the things I thought, well, there's something called statistics. You can be a statistician. That seemed to be a job. I wasn't sure exactly who hired statisticians, but that looked to be a job. Another one related was to be an actuary for an insurance company. So I started, so I found there were a couple of courses in statistics. And there was one given in the mathematics department by a fellow who didn't know much about statistics, who I could already see didn't know very much. But he did have a lot of, he did have some good readings. So I started reading this myself, and rather quickly I was reading new papers, the original papers. And there was some fascinating work, I won't go into details, keep the time down. So I was reading them already as an undergraduate. And this sounded to me like something that was really possible. And as I also pursued the actual, I won't go to that. And I got involved in also as part of the statistics, I learned about probability theory and about uncertainty. It was a very comforting thing. I had thought the world was very uncertain, even then. Because partly because the experience of the Great Depression certainly gave you the idea that things were uncertain, but in general, when I looked into almost anything, whether it's religion or history, there was an awful lot unknown and uncertain, and you couldn't see the future. And probability theory is very, very comforting personally, in addition to its practical importance as a basis for statistics, was that it means you could say something certain about uncertain things. That was extremely comforting, and I've never gotten over that. It's been a recurrent theme, and I think my current interest in things involving randomness, economic treatment of uncertainty, and theory of insurance has really been a continuous play out of this early feeling. But of course, that doesn't mean that jobs were easily available in any case. It's any kind of job. So, in fact, I took an examination to be a government statistician, and they had the same problem. There was a huge, long list of people, and I came from a state, New York State, which was overly represented in the civil service. So there was a tendency to give preference to other states over New York because of the fact that New Yorkers were very much frequently hired. This is I graduated in 1940, to give you an idea. The war had already broken out. In Europe, there was a concern about our being involved. And having really but I had no definite career, so I decided to go to graduate school. It's clear that graduate school was good. I came from a family which valued education extremely highly. It was taken for granted, of course, even though my mother had not gone to college, but my father had, that I and my two younger sisters would certainly go to college. In fact, we all wound up with graduate degrees. That was taken for granted. And therefore, the idea of going to graduate school, although it wasn't exactly necessary, was a good thing. My father's idea was I should get a PhD and then go into business. The idea of he didn't think much of an academic career. He didn't think about it. I don't think so much that he didn't think much of it. He just didn't think it wasn't in his perspective. One thing I do pride myself on, I try to take every advantage to learn something. In the summer of '40, I was looking for some job, a summer job, just to get me a little money. And walking on the streets, I saw a sign from an insurance company. I thought, well, that's a good idea. When I see it, and they turned out they would hire me as a clerk, what they call an actuarial clerk, right, the lowest level, for the summer. And I was calculating the premiums on some rather odd policy that they had just introduced. But I learned an awful lot. I learned all the language, and it turned out over 20 years later, when I wrote something, I'll come back to it, all that really turned to be very good stead. I really learned a whole lot of concepts which I wouldn't have thought about if I was just approaching it. Anyway, I went to graduate school to study. I wanted to study statistics. That was my aim. And Columbia, which was in New York City, was at that point a great center for this. Still is a major center. There were very few. Mathematical statistics was not a very widely taught subject, and in fact, you couldn't get a degree in it. There was a statistics program at Columbia, but there was no department corresponding to it. So you had to enroll in some other department. And there were two very famous statisticians, the names of which may still mean something to you: Harold Hotelling and Abraham Wald. Who were major figures, and we knew them at the time. They were major figures, it was clear. So it was among the great centers. In fact, it was probably the best place in the United States to study statistics, as it happens, and it was very convenient because I lived in the city, and I could save money by living at home and so forth. The question of what department to enroll in, well, Hotelling, as it happens, his appointment was in the economics department. He had written a few papers on economics. Somehow the economics department, as around 1930, thought they ought to have a statistician, and they hired him. So he encouraged me to join the economics department. And of course, I had to take courses in economics. He gave a course in his own interest in economics, which fascinated me. I really had no idea that you could, and of course, use mathematical methods, and it just took me by surprise. The graduate students were, to give them a place to work, they put desks in the library, in the stacks where the books were. There was space there, and you could fit them in, and they weren't bothering anybody. And this was just perfect for me because I was right next to all those books, which I never heard of, which in fact I was pretty adventurous because my teachers didn't hear a lot of this new work either, didn't know the new work either. I won't go into it, but the Columbia department was a very disorganized place, even by the standards of that period. In economics, the statistics was marvelous. The economics was not so good, but I had all these books, and I started picking up, and I found a book by an English economist I never heard of, and nobody in the department ever heard of, named John R. Hicks. And I wasn't the only people. Since then, I've talked to people elsewhere who also found Hicks's book just enormously liberal. It was the first good treatment of general equilibrium theory in English. In fact, it was probably the first really good treatment since the original work of Walras in 1871. It raised all 1874. I'm sorry. Well, it raised all sorts of very, very interesting issues, because the real question was how to deal with a world in which time occurs, when you're making commitments for the future, investments, savings, and so forth. And this is something that Walras was very unsatisfactory about. And Hicks really presented the problem in a novel way. I could see there were a lot of open questions. I started the study, and I was a very kind of superior student, but I was also, the things I most enjoy reading are the ones that I'm most critical about. I really try to not just read them, but assimilate them. And this means I said, well, gee, I don't quite understand that, and he doesn't seem to have covered this point, and of course, he didn't cover this point. So it posed problems. But that's what I think. If you really start getting yourself involved in anything, I always find that there are issues the author hadn't thought about, or thought about it and didn't treat properly, or something. Sometimes you find in Hicks actually were statements that this isn't a very satisfactory treatment, was roughly the best I could do right now. So actually he was pretty candid about it, but other things he didn't recognize the implications of. But the one thing as I said, I was a very good student all the time, but I was very worried and felt disturbed about the fact I didn't seem to have any new ideas. I could see problems, but I didn't have any real ideas. This was serious. I was disturbed by this. Well, at this point, and you remember the time frame, the United States entered the war. It was Pearl Harbor, and I enlisted. And of course, I was looking around, since I was going to enlist, I was going to look around for something I could, it wasn't too far from what I had been doing, so I could not do something a little useful. And I wound up in the nearest thing, there wasn't anything very close, but the nearest thing was meteorology. I was the weather forecasting. So they sent me to go into a school, a university that had a weather program. Very few. Their meteorology departments are very rare. I think then there were 4 in the United States. I think there's still only 4. In fact, I'm not even sure about that. There are only a few. It's not a popular subject, so I went to one, was sent by the Army to one of these universities, studied meteorology. And just to anticipate something, one of the early lectures by the professor who was teaching the basic theory of meteorology, what's called dynamic meteorology, talking about why the temperature of the Earth is where it is and not basically 20 degrees warmer or 20 degrees colder. And he went into the physics of the atmosphere, particularly, and it turned out there's a whole atmosphere, but most of it's totally irrelevant. But in the middle, in the atmosphere, are scattered a number of, mostly relevant to the question of temperature. It's relevant to a lot of other things, like whether we breathe it or not, but not to the question of the temperature. But it turned out there were certain things that gases that occurred in fairly small amounts, but mattered a great deal. I won't try to go into the physics of the situation here. And one of them was carbon dioxide. And he said, after going through this, he said, well, as a matter of fact, many people have been arguing that since the Industrial Revolution, we're putting an awful lot more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, so we can reasonably expect that the world will be getting warmer, as in 1942. Actually, as many of you may know, the first important the first proposal on this line was done in 1890s anyway, by Svante Arrhenius, the great Swedish chemist. Was actually the first person to advance the view that the industrialization will affect the temperature. I didn't know that. I only learned that recently, as a matter of fact. I never knew who was the author of this idea. Well, it's one of these things I didn't think of it as being terribly relevant to me. My job in the Army was going to be forecasting for the next 24 hours or the next couple of weeks, and long-term trends weren't particularly relevant. This was just part of our background, just to the subject. This military experience, however, did give rise to one thing. It was my first published paper, which appeared in the Journal of Meteorology. And I think it was interesting because it showed something I think was worthwhile as a pattern and as something, a way to approach it. We were asked I was in a research unit, in case I didn't make it clear. I was a research unit, which had a variety of activities we aren't going to. When they were given the following, I think it was an airplane manufacturing company, but they had a branch, did the research, and they came up with an idea of how to use the winds to navigate, to determine, by navigate I mean the plane decides to go in a certain direction. It doesn't go exactly in that direction because the wind blows it out of its path. And the question is, how to set you want to go from A to B, and how to set your heading. It was sent to us for review. What do we think of it? I looked at this thing and I said, they're asking the wrong question. The problem is the question is the wrong question. The question is how to use the winds to get there as fast as possible, which is not the way it was put. So I found this to be very intriguing, and a couple of other people were in my division were working on it. But I didn't really know how to approach a problem like that. Luckily, there was a mathematician, one of the German refugees in the United States, who happened to be visiting, and so we asked him, did he know any references? Oh yes, he said there were, or maybe he was asked and he looked it up. There were a couple of papers in Europe. It happens, I learned because in those days mathematics was very much a German-dominated subject, and even the textbooks that were used were in the United States were sometimes in German, because there was the textbooks were so superior, at least in one course that was German. And so I had actually studied some German in order to be able to read it. I didn't know very much, and German language is pretty complicated. But the mathematicians usually wrote simpler German, and it's not like reading a novel in German. Mathematics is a lot easier to read. So I was plowing through these German papers, and I found there's one trove. They did indeed explain how to use the winds to get from place A to place B in the shortest time, but they assumed that the Earth was flat. I'm not joking. I'm not the least exaggerating. Now, if you're flying a few hundred miles, that's probably not a particularly serious issue. However, we were trying to get planes. The big issue was getting our bombers across the Atlantic to use them in the bombing of Germany. That was, several thousand miles. They couldn't fly all the way, but they flew from Newfoundland, if you know your geography, to Scotland, as far as they could get in those days with gasoline. And the point was not to get them there fast in terms of, that didn't make any difference, but you wanted to use as little fuel as possible, because fuel was in short supply. So it was the same thing as getting there in minimum time. Well, anyway, I solved this problem. I actually figured out how to correct for the curvature of the Earth. And there was, it was a calculus of variations problems, in case any of you know mathematics. So I was very proud of it. It gave me the feeling I could actually solve a problem. And I thought it was two interesting. One is it was to recognize what the problem really was. It wasn't just a question the first question is what the problem really was. And I said there were two steps there. One was that it was an optimization problem, and the other is that it was used a mathematical technique. The other is you needed techniques. You did have to know the techniques. Actually, this is when I had to learn them. So I never taken a course in the subject. But I learned it by reading these papers. There were two basic papers, then there were several others that were involved. Well, I'm probably taking too much time here. Return to graduate study, and so what I'm going to do now is redo all the problems I had in Hicks. So which is not a very inspiring thing, and I was not really. I was correcting this and saying this. He should have said this, and he didn't take account of this. But it was not terrible. It was not terribly inspiring, except for one problem. I found that it was always said remember he considered firms lasting over a period of time. So essentially a firm would want to maximize profits, and they'd want to maximize the sum of the discounted profits. Okay, straightforward. However, he said he was very conscious of the fact that we don't really have the prices. We don't have markets which tell you what the prices are going to be. If I put in a machine now, I'm going to produce some product over a number of years. I don't know what the prices are going to be. His big stress was that prices change over time. But we don't know what the prices are. And so you can imagine, so that means the following. Supposing you have a firm with many owners, which is, of course, what dominant firms in the modern world are corporations with many owners. Well, they all want to maximize profits. They have no particular conflict of interest, but they may have different ideas of what the future is going to bring, so that one group may say, oh, we want to invest in project A. Another says, no, because of their predictions. Others says, no, I like B because I think the world is going to go that way. So how do you decide? Well, reasonable thing. A majority of the stockholders, right? If you can imagine, I mean, there's obviously a great deal more to than that. Even then I knew that, but that was a starting point. The majority of the stockholder, majority meaning, of course, majority of the shares. The stockholder, it's not one stockholder, one vote, but you have as many votes, you have shares. Okay, sounds reasonable. Well, I thought, in order to make this a theory of the kind we're accustomed to, the theory says usually you have a preference ordering of some kind. There's things, like some things better than others. And this is a consistent set of preference. So if I like A better than B and B better than C, I like A better than C. Okay, so if I'm going to say the firm prefers project A to project B, by of course a majority, and project B to project C, then it better prefer project A to C. Well, it took about 15 minutes of writing down examples to see that was not a true theorem. Well, you see, I reacted the wrong way to that. Instead of saying, boy, never mind the rest of this dissertation, that is a good issue, I said, oh my God, that's interfering with what I'm interested in, and I put it aside and try to figure out some other way. By the way, it's a problem that in my mind has never been fully solved to this day, how the theory as applied to the theory of the corporation. Because, I mean, there's a lot more to the story than I've given, because people buy and sell stock. It's not as though, it's not like a political situation where you belong to the political system. You can get in and out. You have to take account of that. And to this day, although there have been a number of papers on this subject, to my mind, we just still have a good theory of firm behavior when you take account of all these circumstances. Anyway, and let me just jump ahead then. Um, so I didn't pursue this at the moment. However, a few years later, also, I spent a summer consulting with a military agency called the RAND Corporation. It now does a lot of civilian work, civilian assistance. And in the summer, which was, however, a very research-oriented thing. They were pioneers in developing game theory, because there was this idea that game theory might be useful in military or diplomatic strategy. It was a very research. It was intended to be an organization devoted to basic research with an ultimate aim for the defense program, but pretty ultimate. And somebody there asked me, he said, you know what, I don't understand. We're talking about the Soviet Union, the United States. These are abstractions. These are composed of people. And they may have different opinions and different views. How do you put them together? I said, oh, well, I think, I won't say, I won't go into detail, but there were papers which already appeared on the subject in the economics context. I said, oh, well, it's been discussed by Abram Bergson. He said, oh, well, why don't you write up an exposition for us? Well, the minute I started writing it, I realized it was the same problem as the one I had already faced. It was the same as the corporation. And I said, well, okay, majority voting doesn't work, but there must be some other techniques. And I thought of this one and that one, and then none of them seemed satisfactory. So finally, this all took place in a few days. I said to myself, well, you know, what do I mean by saying they're not satisfactory? I finally said there were just two possibilities. One is this intransitivity, namely A is better than B, B is better than C, but C is better than A, the cyclicity. And there was the other problem is that I may be choosing between A and B, but I use information about the preferences for something else that's not available. So I said, well, let me see a rule. I put those two now as conditions on the rules. And I said, maybe there's an impossibility result here. And then, anyway, within a few days, the whole thing worked out. And I said, I've now got a doctoral dissertation. Never mind all that stuff I've been working on. I've been working with a professor who was not very mathematical, actually. Well, Hotelling, who was my great teacher, had left for another university, so I couldn't work with him. And I wrote to this fellow, Howard, was very flexible. I said, I think I've got an idea for a dissertation. And he said, well, he looked at it and thought it must be one. He didn't have any competence to check it or anything. But he was very, he said, yeah, it looked like a very good idea to him. And I spent, 4 or 5 months taking these ideas and writing them up. And it became the social choice theory, and it made my reputation. Now so that's how I got to that. Now, then at that point, having actually done something which was worthwhile, I found I could do other things. It really sort of broke the barriers. And but it's interesting, problems come in different ways. One of the next things I worked on was general equilibrium theory. I had been very interested in general equilibrium theory, as you can see, to begin with. But the idea there was a question as to whether the conditions of general equilibrium were even consistent with each other. It turned out, in the course of my reading, that it turned out that some German writers in the 30s had been raising this question. There were models which looked like, they took general equilibrium models which seemed to give, weren't consistent. That there was no set of prices which would clear all the markets. And, well, I won't go to the details of that, but at this point, John Nash wrote this very famous 4-page paper, which I thought as the maximum influence per page that of any paper I've ever heard of. I've been writing, when I wrote my dissertation on social choice, everybody used to write 300-page dissertations. And I was going to try to get this under 100 pages. It was actually 102. I was very disappointed when it kind of printed up. But a 4-page paper, So I don't, the minute I saw it, just knew that it was brilliant. But then it occurred to me, this looks to me like it has something to do with general equilibrium theory, even though it's a kind of equilibrium, it's a different kind of equilibrium, but you could see there was some resemblance, just intuitively. Now that's an idea which struck lots of people. I must have been at least 6 people who had the idea and worked on it as it turned out afterwards, that Nash's results could, by using the methods that Nash used, not the results, but the methods, could give rise to a proof of the existence of general equilibrium. But, and among them, I worked out one. Gerard Debreu, who had very similar intellectual development, came out with something very, very much like the same thing, totally independently. We had a strange correspondence where I went to Europe on a traveling fellowship. I arrived in Rome, and in those days, you went to the American Express office to get your mail, because the regular mail service was very poor. And this is, of course, pre-electronic era. And there was a book manuscript from Debreu saying, well, I see I was working on the same thing, but I see you've gotten it there first. I had circulated it. Got me. Next day, oh no, you made a mistake. I got it, so I'll publish it. And I couldn't see there was any mistake. And next day, oh no, that's not a mistake. It's perfectly all right. Third day, yes, there is a mistake. And look at this one, this was a mistake. I had not proved something right. But then I said, how did he handle it? And I realized he had made the same mistake. But it was put in a different form, so he didn't recognize it. It was the same problem. Anyway, at that point I wrote back and said, well, I think we can figure out a way to repair it. Let's make it a joint paper. I thought my priority had been destroyed by this event. We published it, but so one other version actually was published before ours, Lionel Mackenzie's, but for various reasons, I think ours is much more satisfactory. We did things much more carefully, and that's something hasn't changed. But the general idea, and it turned out in the next couple of years, 3 or 4 more papers, all sorts of people had seen that. So it was one of those, this is one of the things that does happen frequently in the history of thought in almost any field, that people come simultaneously. And the reason is clear. It's because something else has changed. Some technique has been improved. Somebody's gotten some empirical results, some theoretical result, whatever it is, and suddenly you can see lots of things to do with it. So suddenly there's a whole development. So it's not terribly mysterious. Around the same time, now this is, okay, in the case of social choice and general equilibrium, well, in the case of social choice, I really saw the problem as well as the solution. Nobody had really thought this as a major. I say this person who interrogated me saw it as a problem, and Olaf Helmer, but in a sense, the depth of the problem was something that I recognized. The general equilibrium, lots of people knew it was a problem. There had already been a literature on it which did some nice work, but didn't really cover it in generality. But it was a problem out of the literature then. The next one was something that I've had over and over again. I've had a number of times. It was more like the weather forecasting one, the navigation one. It was a problem that was posed. People asked, so here's a problem. What can you do about it? And the problem was, it really rose in the military, but it really by itself it was equally applicable to civilian. How do you hold inventories? What are the conditions on how do you decide how much inventory to hold? And there was some literature already. People had been, it's a practical problem. Some people had already done some theorizing on it. And I and a couple of colleagues looked at this problem, and we reformulated it in a new way, essentially combining 2 different strands, which had never been combined before, and it created a new way of posing the problem. Made it into a really dynamic problem. I won't try to elaborate here. And again, created a new again, it was probably has to do with uncertainty. That's with inventories. The demand for the sales are uncertain, so your need for inventory is uncertain. You can't, of course, replenish them instantaneously, so you have to make a statement today as what tomorrow. There's a certain probability that you will run out, that you won't have enough, and it's never optimal to fully cover, turns out. So we gave rise to a dynamic inventory problem, and that, I think, that turned out also to create a new branch of research, which I thought was, I've been rather proud of. So this was a result of a challenge, if I put it this way. I was really asked the question. And one thing I found very useful, to listen to people who ask questions. You get an awful lot of ideas. You can't always think of all the questions that ought to be asked. I mean, there's no reason for you to think of. There's so many things around. And it sometimes pays to be in a situation where you're supposed to answer questions. And this came up a few years later, in the early 60s. Well, let me mention something that was not really, okay, let me mention something from the early 50s first. And it's part of the general equilibrium, but the question was, how do you bring uncertainty into general equilibrium? Supposing people know that they don't know the future. They have probability distributions, but there are known uncertainties, and you may want to trade them. I may want somebody else to assume the risk. Now, we know this in insurance contracts. You go to an insurance company and buy coverage for your life or your fire that your house may burn down or things of this kind. You're prepared to, you want to get this uncertainty shifted to others, and by shifting to a lot of others, you can reduce the cost. The total cost, in a way, is reduced. So this is the idea behind insurance. That's a familiar idea. And the question of making a general theory out of it was something that I had this rather strong background in probability theory and statistics. And this was something I said there's a problem here. This is something I just developed without being asked. And came up with a formulation which has been widely used. To be perfectly candid with you, the recent experience of the financial markets has led me to rethink it and realize it wasn't as good as I thought. It says, in effect, the more you securitize, I mean, you might draw this implication, the better, because you distribute the risks more widely. Well, I think now, this isn't the place to go into a lecture, that there were problems I didn't see in this problem. And I'm now reconsidering it. But it's still nevertheless a bit of the contribution. Well, I had this background in the economics of uncertainty in several dimensions. I got a call one day from a person who was at that time a program officer for the Ford Foundation. The Ford Foundation, the Ford family had endowed a foundation which at that time was extremely wealthy and was devoting itself primarily to supporting research. It's shifted its emphasis quite a bit toward more practical problems, less research-oriented, more immediately applied problems. But at that point, it was putting a large investment into research. And one of the program officers, they set up an economics program, among others. It wasn't only economics, but had the following idea. He's a man named Victor Fuchs, who has been subsequently a president of the American Economic Association and a leading health economist, probably the leading health economist in the United States. I didn't know him at that time, personally. Well, it seems he had the idea of taking certain social problems, education, relief for the poor, and health, and having one study done by somebody, practical person in the field, and one study done by a theorist who hasn't worked on this problem at all. Or, well, theorist, but usually the theorists hadn't worked on the problem at all. And to see what new insights you could get from theorists. And would I work on health? Well, this I found irresistible. And it was a challenge, and this is subsequently, I've done this several times, this is the best outcome, and it's precisely because I had done nothing like it before. The really interesting thing is not when you're saying, oh, well, I worked on this and this is an application. It's when you haven't thought about it at all. Then you really get to it. And so I diligently read up on what was known about what the economists have written, what the costs of health care are, what insurance, and particularly the role of insurance, because that was something that I was better equipped. Some of the ideas from my actuarial clerkship began to reappear. That's 20 years later, more than 20 years later. And I had assembling, but there are problems here. Why, for example, why is insurance, what difficulties are there in health insurance? Well, the difficulty was that in a sense, the doctor knows more about the problem than the insurance company does. And more about so if the insurance company is going to pay for it, the doctor is going to prescribe a lot of expensive things, because this is effectively reducing the budget constraint. You're getting rid of the things cost, or at least reduce. Of course, the insurance is never 100%, so it's not you're left with some cost, but at least it greatly reduces the cost, and therefore, according to usual economic theory, you're going to overuse it. But and then I began to think, well, there's also a problem between the physician and the patient. How does the patient know the physician is really doing a good job, is working hard enough? The physician knows more by definition than the patient. Therefore, the patient is in no good position to check. So I began to put these all together. I said, there's a fundamental, simple principle behind, or simple, not a principle, but a question, a problem behind all this, and namely, that you have transactions between people with different information. And I see, because of my interest in statistics, the concept of information was a significant one, that the idea of people could know different things. It was possible for you to know different things than I do. And in fact, you may know more about me than I do, in the case of the physician, because training and so on. So there's a triangle here between the physician, the insurance company, and the patient, and there's a lot of asymmetry. So the underlying principle is this asymmetric information, and this connected up with some of the ideas in insurance. And the insurance companies have always talked about so-called adverse selection, for example. Adverse selection. The insurance companies typically sell life insurance, and they also sell annuities. Annuity says, once you retire, let's say you starting at age 65, you have an income for the rest of your life. The lifetime is uncertain, insurance companies are saying. Now with annuities, the insurance company essentially loses when you live long. With life insurance, they lose when you die early, because they collected less in the way of premiums. Well, it turns out that, and insurance companies do, of course, give you medical examinations. Nevertheless, people who take out annuities live several years longer on the average than people who take out a whole life. And the most obvious explanation is those who feel they're pretty healthy take out annuities, and those who are a little dubious about their health take out life insurance, and they know better than the insurance company knows. It's an asymmetric information case. And that's called adverse selection. There are a lot of other examples of that, and it's a big problem with any kind, not only with health insurance, but with a lot of financial divisions. And the other is the so-called moral hazard. If I'm insured, like my house is insured fire, I'm not so careful as I might otherwise be. So that my behavior is changed, or the insurance, or the patient, the physician recommends more expensive patients. These are moral, and these terminology I picked up from my little actuarial experience, and turned out between them and the fundamental theory as a theorist as to what was wrong with the standard theory of behavior under uncertainty, enabled me. It wasn't so much an application; it was why it didn't work. And these all fitted together. So I really had an interesting insight, which I think has had I think I can safely say, has had a very big influence. In some ways, I think it's the most original paper I ever wrote, actually, even more than maybe that social choice. Now, let me to conclude by giving some motivations, I really talked, actually I want to allow time for questions. Yeah, but I want to, okay. I've always been very concerned about socially concerned. I would have said when I was in college, I was a socialist. And of course, it was easy to say that the economic system was working the capitalist system didn't look very good in the 1930s. And of course, one thing I got out of my economics was this idea of externalities that people, that idea had been explored already, and I think I think we've enriched our understanding. There was really a basic understanding, particularly in the work of an economist you may have forgotten about named Arthur Pigou. And so I always knew about this. It wasn't to begin with a focus of my work, but the smoke nuisance, the idea of, well then in the post-war period, there began to be a lot of concern about local air pollution in the United States and in the West. Well, there were several catastrophes, by the way. There was a 47, I believe there was a smog situation in London. There was with London subject to fogs, but what really made a thing was the smoke from all the coal furnaces, the coal which heated the houses. And the number of the deaths was clearly well up, and it could be attributed. I mean, thousands of people died. So something similar happened in Pennsylvania, something happened in Belgium, along the same line. So this began to attract the question that air pollution was an externality of the most classic kind, the kind that had already been discussed in the textbooks. And water pollution was another serious issue. And there began to be movements for it, but the question then how to do it. So the idea of, began to get interested in the idea, which didn't seem like a highbrow theory question because it seemed rather obvious, namely you impose taxes, instead of doing things like regulations, you impose taxes and essentially use a price-like system for externalities. I also got interested then in the early 1962, I spent a year as a staff member of the Council of Economic Advisors in the United States. At that point, everybody was interested in Keynesian policy, macroeconomics. So I was the only one in the council who really cared about microeconomic problems. So I got the microeconomic problems. I can't say I can't say my performance was utterly spectacular, although I did two things, prevented two items of expenditure because essentially applying benefit cost analysis. One was government support for a supersonic transport, which I opposed strongly. I was asked for an opinion on it and wrote a very strong attack on it, which I think is subsequent. Although from a theoretical point of view, the point is perfectly simple. It was just a question of pointing out that the gains, there couldn't be any major gains from this, and it was going to be very expensive. And then the other one is the idea of a second Panama Canal, which I mean, my job was to show it was pointless, but it was part of a big political game of some kind of, which I was only a small player, but I was the economic leg to show that there was no economic basis. But the idea was to use atomic explosives. And the reason for that, obviously, was to make the atomic bomb look a little more respectable. So there was luckily, this was in the Kennedy days, and the president's science advisor was very worried, was glad to have the economic support, so that was not I had no problem. It was some other groups that were pushing this. So the economics was, in a way, a minor player, but it was important to show that this second Panama Canal was pointless. But it did bring me and make me interested in the whole question of social policy, and in particular, dynamic questions, things with long time horizons. So I began to get into the question of the social discount rate. And this has been important. A large part of most of my research in the last 20 years has been the question of discounting the future, how to evaluate future benefits and costs, how to take account of the uncertainties in them, how to think about the matter, and I've evolved my thinking in some ways. And of course, it ties in with an earlier, well, papers that had actually appeared in the 1930s, but nobody paid attention to them, particularly Frank Ramsey's paper on the theory of savings and how it's developed. And since then, I've written quite a bit on the law, but many others have too, on the question of the rate of discount. How do you take account of the importance of future generations? What weight do you give to them? Now, you don't get an answer. You get some considerations which delimit the possible answers. And then the question of uncertainty and so on. All these, and now the big focus of all this has been, in recent years, of course, been the climate change issue, because the climate change has time horizons far beyond our normal. So we've had long high horizons. There's been a tradition in the United States, particularly especially in the western and some of the extreme western parts, where it's very dry. The question of things like water resources, putting up dams, and you regularize, adjusting for the seasonal flows, redistributing water from one place to another. This has given rise, this is not trivial, and this has given rise to literature, and it's relevant to that. But that's measured in perspectives like 50 and 60 years, which is well beyond the normal. But of course, the climate change involves perspectives of hundreds of years. This has been a major part of my analysis. So it's part of this question of trying to make the work socially relevant. Well, I think I mean, I can go endlessly onto my work, which just fascinates me, but probably not you. But this, I think, are the major themes. And I think I've tried to give you some idea of how I came to them. As I say, there's a variety of ways. Sometimes somebody asks me some question, I'm called into it, and I feel socially responsible. Oh, I must mention one more, I should say. It's not from a scientific contribution, not from the theoretical, development of economic theory of any originality, but it's an example of my feeling of response. What's it, about 6 years ago? No, 7 years ago. Yeah, I got a call. There's an organization in the United States called the Institute of Medicine, which is a thing to which people who do research in medicine are elected to. And it's an organization which is then called upon to occasionally organize research activities. The idea is not to really do new research, but to synthesize research available insofar as it's relevant to some policy. Well, the question was of antimalarial drugs. It was very tough. It turns out there has been a drug which has been used since the early 50s. And it's not 100% effective or anything like that, but it has, it's useful. It does reduce, it significantly reduced the deaths from malaria. It cured people. It cured a good number of people, say half the cases or something like that. We still don't have anything which really cures, which is sure to cure malaria. We have the drugs which will. The problem was that resistance had developed to it. It was very cheap. It was sold for 10 cents a dose in Africa, commercially. Now, that was the thing I didn't realize until I got into this, that it was commercial. Anyway, it became useless. It's become useless because of the development of resistance. And meanwhile, fortuitously, the Chinese had developed some new drug by looking at a 3rd century AD herbal textbook. Believe it or not. I think it was just pure luck, because it turns out there's another textbook which says exactly the same remedy for another disease. I won't mention it, a little indelicate to mention, but and it's apparently entirely useless for that purpose. So anyway, this drug. Anyway, but the Chinese found it, tested it, and it really does work. The question, however, it's a good deal. It was a good deal more expensive. And why expensive is not by if malaria were a Swedish disease, you'd all be using this drug because it's like $2 a dose. So it's nothing. However, the people who have malaria don't live here. They live in Africa or in Southeast Asia. There's Latin America too to some extent, but it's not quite as an acute problem there. The two big regions are Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, Thailand, Vietnam, Myanmar. And there, $2 a dose is not a trivial matter. Particularly in Africa, the Thais are at a distinctly higher level. And the question was how to arrange the distribution. Well, of course, you have to collect. The minute I understood the problem, I realized. Anyway, it turned out, of course, the problem is from theoretical. It's a question of where you put the subsidies and how to do it. And I spent, roughly, I chaired this committee, and it was spent like 2 years making sure we had collected all the data that you could collect. These data aren't terribly good. And establishing it, but I was pretty sure before we began exactly what our recommendations were going to be, and I tried not to impose them on the committee, and indeed they were. Essentially subsidizing it, but the question is how to subsidize it. It was obvious you had to subsidize it, but the question of how you do it, I won't go try no details. But that was an interesting thing, although it doesn't contribute, I wouldn't call it a research item, in the sense of that the ideas are simple enough. I think it was something I've really enjoyed doing. I never would have done, if I had ever done anything like it before, I probably said, why should I do it again? But because I had never done anything like it, I found it a challenge. And that's what I call upon you to, when you ever have these opportunities, always switch. So 2 things. Look at a problem, ask yourself what the question really is. And if you find some anomaly, that's the place to concentrate. It's the difficulty that you want to it's not the part you understand well, it's the part you don't understand. That's where the payoff is. And where the challenge to you is. And the other thing is, listen. You'll learn, subject yourself to new experiences whenever you can. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken, for this fantastic hour of sharing with us your explorations and great discoveries. If someone has a reflection or some question that you have the chance to ask it right now.
Yeah. Yes, sir. I'm sorry. Oh, well, as a matter of fact, I'll tell you where we recommended that it be done. There's a very interesting question of international politics, because it has not yet been carried out. Although I think it's going to be instituted very shortly. I hope so. I mean, it's been promised, let's put it this way. That an international agency buy the stuff from the manufacturer, set certain specifications. I don't want to go too many details, but there's certain kinds of specifications. You want combination drugs to avoid to make it difficult for this drug to be resistance to develop this drug. You have an international organization buy it from the manufacturer and resell it, preferably to anybody, to any wholesaler, at a very low price, and then let competition keep the price down. That's the recommendation. And I've seen nobody's proposed. I've been at a number of conferences since explaining this idea, and there are objections. People are bringing all sorts of. I've heard no coherent objection that I understand, but it's been. It's going to be tried experimentally. I say for a few countries, beginning. I hope soon. It keeps on getting postponed, but presumably before the end of the year. But it was. The report came out in 2006. I'm sorry, the report came out in 2004. And since then, there's been all these negotiations. The United States government commissioned the report and has taken no role in pushing it, for reasons that I don't understand, actually. I can see no selfish reason. I don't understand any reason why they haven't pushed it, but they haven't. And I really don't even understand the motive. But some European governments have been pushing it. Yes, sir.
I'd be very interested to get your perspective on the cap and trade bill
Mm-hmm.
that's going through the United States
Yeah.
government at the moment, and whether you think, obviously it's a good start, but if it's really there, and just get your perspective really on the economic answers to.
Yeah, well, I'm very much in favor. There's, unfortunately, there are several aspects. It's not a simple matter. Ideally, I would like either a world cap and trade system or a carbon tax, or auctioning off the things. The cap and trade, of course, has the problem that the presently benefit interests are given kind of a windfall. However, it does serve the function of controlling the emissions. The carbon tax, in principle, is equivalent, except that the revenue goes to the government. If the government gets the revenue, then it can be used to, for example, to cut other taxes which are more distortionate. And therefore, there's a gain in that. The general evidence is that some combination of those two would make most firms perfectly well off. See, and they're not going to hurt. Obviously, there's an argument for saying the cap and trade system has the idea of bribing the existing firms, or to put it more elegantly, compensating them for their losses. Which, if you can buy off political opposition, that's all right. There's a theoretical argument for it. It turns out most of the evidence is that firms wouldn't suffer that much, and maybe you should give 20% or something of the trade, give them 20% and make them pay for the rest. Would probably take care of most anomalies. It isn't really necessary if your aim is just to keep them whole. So I think you need some kind of that, but the difficulty is the difficulty is the international situation. I say we advise we'll have a world carbon tax. We do not have a world government. Furthermore, governments are in very different, national economies are in very different states of development. There's a real question, should India be subject to the same restrictions as the United States? There was early on one point of view, you give everybody in the world the right to emit in equal amount. And then, so the poor countries can be compensated by selling these emission certificates to the rich countries. Well, that got nowhere. Has never been taken up. I think that probably would have been the correct solution, but it's not. It doesn't work. The problem is going to be is bringing China and India primarily. China and India, in a short while, will probably be emitting as much as the rest of the world. So in terms of current emissions, even if the United States does come on board, which looks very possible, but I can't be sure of that. If the United States comes on board, it'll join the EU. There are problems. Russia is a problem, by the way, because while they're in the system, they got grossly inflated allotment. So the price in Europe is actually, using the Russian certificates, is too low today. But supposing we can comb those out over a period of time. The real question is going to be bringing China and India primarily. Of course, there are going to be I'm sure there'll be other countries coming along, but those are the two great big ones. Brazil is also another country where the manufacturing is developing pretty rapidly. And there is a justice question. The argument, first, they're poor. Secondly, you might say the problem exists because the rich countries have filled up the atmosphere and created the problem to begin with. And you can argue this back and forth, but the question, But if your aim is to prevent the world from getting warmer, sooner or later, in other words, I think you have to think, I'm looking for a situation in which China and India essentially agree that within 20 or 30 years they come on board. Not immediately. It's hopeless to suggest they come on board immediately, and it's not even just. But we don't have the problem is it's going to be very difficult to develop an international trade in permits. That's so far we have not solved that problem. Another problem is the deforestation. The forests are very good absorbers of that. So it's a good thing to have a lot of forests. Therefore, we really want to pay the Brazilians not to cut down the Amazon, and the Indonesians, I guess, have big forests. Chinese, I think, are mostly cut. Well, there's still there's a fair amount of forest land in China. But the Indonesia's been burning their forests down just to get more agricultural land. And of course, the Amazon Valley is full of that. The Americans actually are reforesting. We actually have more forest land today than we did, more standing timber today than we did 20, 30 years ago. But not very much. Now the question, so you want to reward this. The trouble is, you want to pay for the additional, for the forest you didn't cut down. Well, you can see that's a very tricky matter. And something is going to have to be done along those lines, but nobody's quite solved what to do. Because deforestation is really an effective tool, and you certainly don't want to neglect that.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, and thanks to Professor Arrow for taking us on this beautiful journey and giving us a great moment in life for 1 hour. Thank you. Thank you very much.